just a few focus on 1 or 2 areas or 4 areas I'll touch on. I think the first one from a global perspective, the topical issue is regulatory developments. If you look at it from a financial services point of view, if we're going to do more trade, as the previous speaker mentioned, we need to watch out with the Basel III developments, the impact this would have on liquidity requirements of financial institutions. That is an area of concern, and partnering with the public sector, we should proactively be lobbying to ensure that global developments and global regulatory issues do not adversely affect trade in the continent of Africa. Beyond that, I think Africa is also focused on developing its infrastructure. It is a prerequisite for rate of growth in Africa. You would also have Basel III issues on capital restrictions or capital requirements for Tier 1 capital, etc., which I believe if we don't pay enough attention, some countries eventually would have problems with the financial sector not being able to proactively be engaged in financing the economy because of the focus on risk-weighted assets and the requirements Basel III impose on financial institutions. So obviously, that is one area of requirement for where we require absolute cooperation with the public sector. I think on a more regional basis, if you look at cross-border issues, advisory support is an area of concern for me, and over the years, we've touched on this, but I think the issues of harmonization and alignment of policies, such as legal, procurement processes, trade, etc., remain outstanding. Conversations are ongoing, but we are yet to close on those. So that's another area where I think we absolutely must have these conversations going. The next one will be project prioritization. And we got to ensure that as we prioritize projects, we make them much more attractive for investors. Mind you, we're talking of cross-border projects here. The sums required at large. No one bank in any one market or financial institution in any one market will be able to fund this. So we need to ensure that we make them sufficiently attractive for investors. So there's an area of cooperation in prioritizing projects to ensure that we go beyond political timelines and provide for long-term solutions that address the needs. What you've seen in the past in most countries, it was very interesting last month what was happening in Zambia, as an example. I had politicians made more promises, those in power, than they had ever made before. But surprise, surprise, you all know what the elections, the results of the elections, those politicians ended up not having their way this time. So it is important that we continue having the right conversations that would attract investors and go beyond electoral timelines. Project designs, from project designs, I'm talking of going beyond the technical aspects of the project to incorporate environmental impact assessments that would ensure ecological balance. Increasingly, we would have conversations around what will the environment, what would be the effects on the environment for most of these cross-border projects. And clearly, if you look at those projects, an example that comes to mind is Serengeti migration in southwestern Kenya. If you're going to do a road in that space, you might go beyond the technical designs required for that road, and maybe if you consider the environment, you might want to have an elevated highway. That leaves a balance there. So those are conversations that we have we've been forced to have with some of our partners when we go for roadshows and try to talk on funding for some of these projects. Because across the world today, there's a clear focus on the environment. You would know that sometime this year, the end of this year, Q4, South Africa will be hosting COP17, and those conversations will be very much in the minds of various individuals. I think the next area will be broad-based and proactive stakeholder engagement, which requires deep information flow. The issues on land rights, guaranteed minimum level of usage, etc., are very much on the minds of various stakeholders. Because in some cases, we've actually had projects that have been approved, funding available, but it's been impossible to get them executed because of stakeholder issues. And in this room, I see very many individuals who are prospective presidential candidates like Frank Edu. You know, these guys, we just have to make sure we work in concert with them to ensure that when we move on and they can be able to sell this to respective stakeholders around the space. Project structure, the structure of project governance is also an issue. That's when we've come in, and in the past, we've always accused politicians of embezzlement, etc., but because we've been absent. in talking about project governance, beyond the project board to the project management teams. It means very important, monitoring projects, etc. We can definitely lend assistance in this area, and is a core area of assistance and cooperation. Finally, structure of financial solutions. Most of these projects, they are large ticket items. Financing would require the lenders to provide approximately 70% of the funding. So we need to structure them well. If the shareholders are going to be providing 30% of the funding, we got to be very focused on the fact that you need to go to roadshows at some point in time, and the structure would define your ability or facilitate the process of attracting investors across the space for these cross-border projects. So in summary, I would say regulatory issues require input and conversations that are end-to-end, advisory support for projects, prioritization of projects, project design, broad-based and proactive stakeholder engagements, structure of project governance, and structure of financial solutions. Having said so, I must recognize the fact that these conversations are taking place. There are various organizations across the continent who are dealing with this. But the key issue here is that many a times the conversations have not been sufficient, they've not been with enough rigor. You've not had conversations with enough rigor, and at times they have lacked consistency. Ad hoc conversations are a cardinal sin when it comes to cross-border transactions. I think it's imperative that we start having conversations that are much more rigorous and consistent if we're going to have the end game, which is for a positive multiplier effect, which will lead to employment creation and growth in our economies across the continent of Africa.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.